Good evening, everybody. It has been an absolutely fantastic day here in Cumbria. We have had some absolutely beautiful summer sunshine. And what better way to end the day than on top of a hill overlooking Ullswater, waiting for the sun to set. This evening I've climbed up to the summit of Hallin Fell, and I'm up here to get a shot for my Hand of Man project, featuring this fantastic stone cairn that sits at the top. I've got my camera all set up, my composition is framed, and now it's just a case of sitting back and waiting to see what happens with the light. And while we're doing that, I thought we'd have a little chat about one of my favourite compositional guides, and if you hadn't guessed already, that's the rule of thirds. The term rule of thirds is a little bit misleading because it isn't a rule at all, really. Ansel Adams once said that there are no rules for great photos, only great photos, and I'm certainly not going to disagree with the great man. What the rule of thirds is a compositional aid that can help us to determine where the key elements of the scene should be positioned within the frame. The way that the rule of third works is by dividing a scene into a grid using two horizontal and two vertical lines. And the rule states that the best place to position the key elements in the frame is on one of those lines, with the sweet spots being where two lines cross. In a nutshell, what the rule of thirds is actually trying to get you to do is to move your subject away from the centre of the frame to one side, and to place your horizon so that the sky fills the top third of the frame. Now, the rule of thirds is quite controversial. A lot of photographers don't like it, but I absolutely love it for three reasons. It's simple, which means it's really easy to remember. It's effective, it really does work, particularly if you're just starting out in photography. And it's accessible. And what I mean by that is that the LCD on the back of my camera actually has a rule of thirds grid. So if I'm composing a shot, I can actually see where the thirds sit and where they cross. And also, when I'm cropping in Lightroom, the crop tool also has a rule of thirds grid, again helping me to know where to position those elements. If you've been following my channel for any length of time, you may remember that I was last here back in the autumn, and I was shooting the cairn at sunrise. What was happening was the sun was rising to my right, and that meant that the right hand side of the cairn was illuminated and the left hand side of the cairn was in shadow, and I decided that that was wrong. And what I wanted was the light to be as far to the northwest as you possibly can. Now, we're looking pretty much due north here, and we are about a week away from the summer solstice. So for the next couple of weeks, the sun is going to be almost in exactly the right position. And so this is a composition, this is a shot that I've been working on now for about 9 months. Let's now take a look at a few examples of the rule of thirds in action, starting with this image taken back in the autumn of the Duke of Portland boathouse, which is actually just over there. Now, this shot was composed with the rule of thirds in mind. The boathouse has been placed on the right hand third. The shoreline behind the boathouse extends into the frame as far as the left hand third, and the top of the mountains is run along the upper third, meaning that the top third of the frame is filled with sky. Now, if you are going to use the rule of thirds and you're going to push your subject to one side, you have to be aware of its direction of travel. And this doesn't necessarily only apply to vehicles. It really applies to anything with a very obvious front. And what you want to do is you want to leave the space in front of your subject, space for it to move into. If you leave the space behind it, what you have is the subject looking out of the frame, and the viewer's not expecting that. And that can spoil the harmony of the image. Another way that I like to use the rule of thirds is to divide my scene into layers. So I have my foreground in the bottom third, I have my background in the middle third, and then I have my sky in the upper third. And what that does to great effect, I think, is creates great balance throughout the frame so that no one layer is more dominant than the other. And I think that can be really useful for those of us that are a little bit too prone to having too dominant a foreground. Now, when I use the rule of thirds, I don't always follow it to the absolute letter, and this is a perfect example of that. I've positioned the cairn on the right hand third, and I have the lake, the middle of the lake, where the bottom third and the left hand third intersect. But the horizon is running through the middle of the frame because that's really where it sits naturally. There are times when I ignore the rule of thirds completely, particularly if I'm working with symmetry. So something like reflections, you've got those beautiful reflections. What you want to do is you want to exaggerate the symmetrical nature of the scene, and in order to do that, you run the horizon right through the middle of the frame. Don't put it in the top third, you don't put it in the bottom third, right through the middle. And the other time I ignore the rule of thirds is when my subject fills more than 50% of the frame, and in those occasions I stick the subject slap bang in the middle. It looks like I've been unlucky again with the conditions. A big bank of cloud has now come over and covered up the sun, so I've got light on my background but not on my foreground, not on the cairn. But I guess that does give us a little bit more opportunity to talk a bit more about the rule of thirds. Now, as I may have alluded to earlier, the rule of thirds is actually quite controversial and a lot of photographers don't like it. You see, the problem is there's just as many examples where the rule of thirds doesn't work as there are examples of it working well. You see, composition is a really complicated thing, and it involves a lot more than just positioning your subject in the right place. It's a great place to start, but eventually you're going to want to consider things like leading lines and visual weight, both of which are subjects that I hope to cover in future videos. I think the biggest mistake that you can make with the rule of thirds is to try and force it onto scenes where it just isn't appropriate. The trick with composition is to try and be as sympathetic to the scene as you possibly can. You don't want to have to bend the scene to fit some arbitrary rule. Probably the best approach with the rule of thirds is to spend your time looking for scenes where it is appropriate and works really well. I think for me, an example of a scene where the rule of thirds works really well would be a little bit like this one, where you've got a strong subject in the foreground that you can push off to one side, where you have interest in the background, and where you can place the horizon around the upper third so that the top half of the frame is filled with sky. I think as time goes by, I find myself using the rule of thirds less and less, but that doesn't mean that I don't adhere to the key principles. I usually try and push my subject off to one side, and I usually try to keep my horizon above the centre so that the top third of my frame is filled with sky. But that doesn't mean that the rule of thirds isn't an excellent compositional guide when you're first starting out in photography. So there you go, that's my overview of the rule of thirds. I think it's a really useful guide for helping you to determine where to place key elements within the frame. And if you're just starting out, I think it can help you create much more interesting compositions. It might not be perfect, but it's a great place to start. I think regardless of whether this scene works with the rule of thirds or not, it doesn't work without light on the subjects. And I think as far as that's concerned, we are bang out of luck tonight. So we'll pack up the gear, head home, and we'll go again another time. And I think that's the joy of landscape photography for me. If it was easy, it wouldn't be as much fun.